This is episode 83 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week, our special guest is Amanda Aragon of Kids Can New Mexico, an education advocacy organization based here in the land of enchantment. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Amanda.
Thanks. So close, Paul. New Mexico kids can.
All right. Well, how do people find out about you so they can get it all correct themselves?
nmkidscan.org or at nmkidscan on social media.
Perfect. And you are an educational advocacy organization. You represent them. You're the executive director of said organization. And so we're still digging our way through the aftermath of the 2019 legislative session. The governor's been signing bills. She has until, I believe, Friday of this week to get that all done. And your organization looks pretty closely at education policy in New Mexico. So before we talk about the specifics of the session, talk about broadly your perspective on education issues here in New Mexico.
Yeah, so I think, being a born and raised New Mexican, we have not traditionally had a lot to brag about in terms of education. And certainly I experienced my own problems and challenges within the system. And so New Mexico Kids Can exist to advocate for policies that we believe are really going to drive education forward, better prepare our kids so that they can realistically compete in what continually becomes a more global environment.
And of course, a lot happened, but since the session was completed, there was an announcement made about graduation rates. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are pretty excited about this. Maybe we're too doer at the Rio Grande Foundation, ready to throw shade at such happy news because we look at a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and I know you value that test as well. But talk a little bit about what's going on with graduation rates and your views on the significance of that improvement.
Yeah, so I actually appreciate the Rio Grande Foundation's take on graduation rates because they can actually be very easily manipulated. So I'm always cautious when we look at graduation rates and celebrate their continued increase. New Mexico did just announce our highest graduation rate ever. That said, during that same time period, so if you look at the period of time over, let's say, the last 10 years, and what's happened to our graduation rates in that period of time, they've increased dramatically. All while we've made it more difficult and more rigorous to graduate from high school. So we actually want a high school diploma to mean something. And so students have to show competency in order to earn the diploma. It's not just getting a certain amount of credits like some states. And we've increased the rigor of that competency. So now students have to pass the PARCC assessment in several subjects to be able to earn their diploma. So all of that means to me when we're handing kids diplomas now, it actually means that they're ready. And we have higher graduation rates. So while we still lag the national average, there are a lot of other states that just give diplomas to any kid that gets a certain amount of credit hours, regardless of whether or not they are ready. I don't think that's what we are currently doing in New Mexico, but I am interested to see what happens in the next few years.
No doubt about it. And graduation rates, one of the reasons we have, as an organization, been skeptical is because they can be manipulated. What qualifies for graduation in one state doesn't necessarily qualify in another. So there's a lack of comparison. The NAEP is a test given to a representative sample of students from all over the country. Your child may never take a NAEP test in their 13, 12 years of education. And New Mexico hasn't really seen yet the kind of improvement that the graduation rates would illustrate on the NAEP test, but we can certainly hope that there will be those kinds of improvements as well.
So long as we keep looking to the right indicators for improvement. So again, we stand by NAEP results. It's part of the reason that we've advocated so strongly to keep PARC or a similar assessment, because for the first time in a long time, if you look at PARC results, you look at NAEP results, they're actually fairly similar. When we were using our old assessment, the standards-based assessment, that was a very different story. New Mexico was claiming about 60% of our kids were reading at grade level, all while NAEP was telling us it was much closer to 20 or 30%, depending on which grade level. PARC results and NAEP results actually align much better, so we get a more consistent baseline than every other year.
So let's talk about the PARC, because that's already one of the things that the current administration is changing. Again, not an issue that the Rio Grande Foundation necessarily engaged with in terms of the specifics of PARC, but what does PARC stand for? What is the PARC test? Why is it so controversial? These are all issues that we're having you on the podcast because you're the gal who we know knows the answers to all of these.
Yeah, so the PARC stands for the Partnership for Assessment for College and Career Readiness. Essentially, a bunch of states got together and said, hey, our kids are moving. Like, kids move states. Shocking. And
from state to state.
From state to state. And kids we're all using different assessments.
Right.
And it's confusing, and we're getting lost. So states came together and they formed two consortia. One created an assessment called Smarter Balance, and one created an assessment called PARC. And most states originally joined one of those two assessment groups. The reason that states joined together is the federal government provided money for them to do so. So states got to be a part of developing their own assessment without having to pay for it, which is extremely expensive, which we should note as we move forward. So they're one of the two the federal government mandates that 95% of all students in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school are assessed annually. Mainly, it's a civil rights issue to make sure that we're not dramatically underserving some kids while serving other kids very well. And so PARC is the state's assessment that we use to comply with that federal law.
Now, is PARC an outgrowth of the Obama administration, or is it taking it even a step further, going back to No Child Left Behind? I know you're a state-level person here, but sometimes in policy issues like energy, for example, or something, you see great shifts from administration to administration. But as the federal government goes, as I've watched them, there's actually a fair amount of continuity between the Bush administration and then the Obama administration with regard to these policies. And we can talk about Trump or not, but certainly the testing has been emphasized at the federal level, and that's why you say, money's being provided, et cetera, et cetera. So can you kind of shed any more light on that?
I would caveat the Obama administration as being fairly similar, but with more nuance. So I think, under No Child Left Behind, we saw a lot of pass-fail systems. And largely, that's where our A through F school grading system came from. Under No Child Left Behind, there were very few schools in New Mexico that were meeting adequate yearly progress. So in a system where almost every school is failing, that doesn't actually tell us that much. Likewise, I think the transition to assessment under the Obama administration was more nuanced. We need to kind of caveat performance in more ways than just pass-fail. So how else can we do it? And certainly a lot of the Obama initiatives, including the redesigned assessments, were part of that optic lens of saying, okay, that was good, but can we improve upon it?
Basically, kind of taking a 50,000-foot view, it's the federal government's providing additional resources. That is the carrot. The stick is states have to implement some kind of standardized, and emphasis on standardized, because 50 states doing different things doesn't shed a lot of light on if New Mexico's doing better than Texas and vice versa, and new other states, Ohio, Oregon, wherever they may be. And I can understand, while, Rio Grande Foundation were very much of the constitutional, it's not mentioned in the Constitution, therefore education is not something the federal government should be doing. Well, the bridge has been crossed, the Rubicon, all that stuff, and the federal government is involved now where do we go to make this a more effective way of improving our schools? So all of that copacetic. Now, Park, let's talk about the Lujan Grisham administration. If not the first policy decision that she made as governor,
it was the first.
Pretty darn close. She signed an executive order eliminating that. So I take it you're not a fan of that, and kind of anything you want to say about that, great. But also, what trajectory are we on now with regard to that kind of testing issue?
I mean, New Mexico KidsCan tries to be apolitical. So it is frustrating when we see
there's no such thing as apolitical,
right, do political things. And so we certainly understand that there is a political incentive to get rid of Park. We've seen it across the country. What we've also seen states do, like Tennessee, is go through 3 different assessment systems trying to get it right after Park. So we see states move away from Park. They try and create their own assessment. They realize it's very expensive and very hard to do. Then they implement it. The system crashes, that's what happened in Tennessee. So then they scrap that. They do a new contract with a new vendor. That vendor has problems. They scrap that. And so you have 3 years of just madness in your state's assessment system. So while we won't say it can only be Park, what we will say is this is a really big deal and it should be given a lot of careful thought. And let's not pretend like there's some amazing solution out there that we've just been overlooking. There's the assessments, if you look at US Ed peer reviews, Park is one of the best assessments on the market, if not the very best. Smarter Balance comes closely behind. So if it's just a name thing, that's fine. Let's change the name. Let's call it whatever we'd like to call it. If we want to supplement it with a few more questions about New Mexico history and things like that, that's awesome. But when we participate in the assessment conversations, our number one priority is not losing all of the information that we have from the last 5 years. We have 5 years of good information about where we've been improving, what's been going well, what hasn't been going well. And when you create a new assessment system, if it's not closely enough aligned with the last one, you can't compare anymore. So we're just resetting the baseline, which takes about 3 years. And so 3 years from next spring, we might have a good idea of how our students are doing. And I just don't think we have 3 years to wait.
And the new test, it's already been named, and I forget the name, but
it's the New Mexico Standards-Based Assessment for Mathematics and English Language Arts. Not to be confused with the standards-based assessment that we used to use.
Okay. So this is the Lujan Grisham administration's preferred option. And, kind of getting back to that federal relative continuity between Bush, Obama, and Trump. How do you throw Trump in there in terms of education policy? DeVos is reviled by the unions, but I haven't seen a lot of big Trump education policies coming out. Are they kind of continuing?
Yeah, I think, what we see from the Trump administration is they really inherited the Every Student Succeeds Act.
Right.
So their job is implementation. One of the first things we saw them do is repeal the regulations around Every Student Succeeds Act. So now their job is really just making sure that every state plan is compliant, which this is a big deal for New Mexico because we're in the middle of revising our state plan. So I think they have an important role to play, but they're kind of being more hands-off than I think we've seen in the past.
And the reason I go back to the federal level and coming back down to the state is that in New Mexico now for, Richardson, Martinez, and Lujan Grisham, there's all been this kind of jerking around, if you will, where the policies have been shifting rather dramatically from administration to administration. There's a lot to be said just for continuity to have policies that you can track on a multi-year basis and really understand where you're going, where you've been.
And I think those are important dynamics to note. The way we've trended in education policy in New Mexico, being led largely by Governor Martinez over the last 8 years in her reform efforts, is different than what we saw at a national level. So I remember a lot of people being very upset when the front page picture of the Journal was Secretary Scandaris standing right behind President Obama when he signed the first waiver. So those political dynamics of Republican, Democrat, what that's meant over the last 8 years is interesting for me to watch nationally, because it doesn't always necessarily align with what's happening in New Mexico.
But it is fair to say, and I mean, I think this is fair, that a lot of the policies that Martinez ultimately was engaged in bringing here to New Mexico were policies very much approved by the Obama administration, including but not limited to teacher evaluations.
Approved and incentivized.
Yeah. And I know you know some of this history, but for the listeners out there, Rio Grande Foundation, back when Martinez was candidate for governor, we brought some of our education experts, and these are national name folks, many of whom worked for Jeb Bush, and Jeb Bush is still considered a national reformer in education policy. The 8th Ref grading system, 3rd grade social promotion, emphasis on early childhood reading. All of those are things that Florida focused on, and Florida saw great results. Now, given your experience in education policy, do you think that Martinez mishandled some of the education reforms? Do you think her political kind of hammer approach to New Mexico just wasn't going to work? Or do you think that the unions and the Democrats were just a brick wall upon which God himself could have brought education policy from heaven, put it on stone tablets, and Ellen Bernstein and the Democrats would have rejected it at a whole cloth just because it's a Republican? Or maybe some combination thereof.
I was going to say, very rarely will you find me agree to like one camp or another. I think the answer is somewhere in between. If you look at A through F grading, I mean, that passed in 2011, bipartisan support. Not broad bipartisan support, but it passed with bipartisan support. So that tells me we did have an opportunity to do some good things with bipartisan support. I think as the political machine kind of grew and became more partisan, I think as relationships became more challenged, whether because of union involvement or, whatever it might be, it became harder to come to the table on certain things. And I think we saw that over the last, certainly 4 years of the administration, but probably before that. Mm-hmm. And I think Secretary Scandera's nomination process definitely upped the ante on like how ugly and partisan this work was going to become.
Yeah. It's so you think maybe there was a brief glory days, maybe first year or two, when things would have been possible to move forward a little bit more? Or
and now as I hear myself say that back,
because I'll be frank, I never saw that kind of receptiveness, broadly speaking. But that doesn't excuse, I think Martinez came in with a heavy hand and a kind of a my way or the highway approach. And by Martinez, I mean Martinez and Scandera. So there was a little bit of high-handedness as well.
Yep. And I will acknowledge, sometimes my vision of what's possible is maybe a little bit naive and a little bit overly optimistic. So I think it was going to become ugly, especially as that confirmation process played itself out. It just framed everything with an us versus them mentality that I would like to believe doesn't always have to be there, but for the sake of that confirmation process was absolutely always going to be there.
And just so everybody knows, 3rd grade social promotion, what we're meaning by that is that children have to read by 3rd grade or they would get held back in an extra year. Something that, maybe we're again in la-la land here, but I would think that an education system and the people in control of said system would like an extra chance to get those kids up to speed before they move them on to 4th, 5th, and 6th grade when they're sitting in front of science textbooks unable to read. And one other thing on Jeb Bush, he also in Florida has a robust school choice system, very good charter school law, school vouchers in some places, and a system of school choice tax credits, all of which those are kind of our are fixed ideas out there. And Martinez, for right or wrong, good or bad, that wasn't the angle she took on education reform. So anything on Martinez in the last 8 years before we move on to how this session kind of played out?
I think on the third grade reading topic, whether you agree that we should give these children an extra year of instruction if they're not on grade level by the end of third grade, that aside, previously, over the last 2 years, we saw the department require schools to report how many third graders, how many kindergarteners, how many first graders, second graders, third graders were on grade level, how far were in the lowest category, how many of their parents had been notified, and ask for documentation about that. I think the department released a memo maybe 3 weeks ago saying they're no longer going to ask schools to report that information. So not only are we not necessarily providing that extra year of instruction, take that away, we're not even requiring that schools report on whether or not they are telling parents if their child is not on grade level, which
Right.
Parents deserve to have that information. If a parent wants to allow their child to move forward knowing that, like, that's their choice, but without even notifying the parent, I think is the part that really doesn't give me a lot of hope for what we might see in the coming years.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% on that. And, while Rio Grande Foundation and Martinez and even Kids Can New Mexico, we may not always be on the same page. I think, and I'll set this up, now we're moving forward here. The way education policy is going to be driven now, and we could have told this from the transition team, which was chock full of education union folks, is a lot more money and a lot less accountability, broadly speaking, moving forward. There doesn't seem to be the emphasis on accountability, let alone school choice. I mean, the idea is that choice and school vouchers or tax credits or even charter schools, those are all on the bad list for folks that are in control now. So, session, as you kind of see it moving forward, I mean, do you agree or disagree with my broad assessment there?
I agree with a caveat around charter schools. I think we definitely heard and may continue to hear rhetoric from those in charge about charter schools not being good. I think what we were able to do, we as in the collective community, were able to do during the legislative session is show that there's a huge desire, and in this community in particular, for charter schools, that parents are desperate for an option that is better than the one that their child is currently forced into. And what we were able to do there is find some champions on the Democrat side in the legislature that were willing to stand up for that and create a little bit of a discomfort, I think, for Democrats and saying, like, which side of this are you going to fall on? And just by creating that division, I think we were able to minimize the impact. I mean, we went into session thinking we would come out with a charter school moratorium. Mm-hmm. And if not a full moratorium, definitely a cap on enrollment.
So talk about that legislation specifically, because it's not the first rodeo for a charter school moratorium that passed the House, or almost passed
the House.
But then you had primary opponents that got beat.
Right. So the only reason that didn't pass the House 2 years ago is because 3 Democrats crossed party lines.
Carl Trujillo,
Debbie Rodella, and Patricio Villalobos. So right. 2 of those 3 we weren't coming into this session with because they lost their primary. Right. And that was extremely concerning. Mm-hmm. Luckily, some Senate Democrats came through and really delivered pretty big wins for us. But that so there were 2 aspects. The one that we were looking at first was the charter school enrollment cap. So there was a proposed cap that was really about 2,000 more students than we currently have today. And that was in these big omnibus spending bills. So not only did we have to fight the cap, but we had to figure out a way to do it without saying we're opposed to these other things that just were widely desired. Mm-hmm. Teacher salary increases, at-risk spending increase, and, oh, by the way, this cap on charter school enrollment. We were able to get those out of both bills, of House Bill 5 and Senate Bill 1. And then we knew that if that happened, if that charter school enrollment cap came out of those two bills, that we would likely see the moratorium introduced, which is exactly what happened. The amendments were made, the cap came out, the moratorium bill was introduced. It never made it out of its first committee, but never got heard in its second. I think by that time there was just, great. The Public Charter Schools of New Mexico released the survey that they had done with research and polling showing broad support for charter schools. There were some really great headlines in the New Mexican and in the Journal. And I think it just became something that people didn't want to fight this year.
Kind of a note of irony in all this is that I think most observers of the legislature would say that this was the most urban-focused legislature. The urban areas flexed their muscles more than they ever have in a session in New Mexico. And of course, charter schools in particular are a big issue for where? Urban areas. Rural communities not necessarily as impacted individually as the urban areas. So thankfully, due to your hard work and a lot of other folks' hard work, charter schools are saved again. Now, I know there's small school funding issues. Now, how did that pan out?
So small school size adjustment was something that used to be a part of the funding formula that was really intended to help rural schools get enough money to compensate for economies of scale. What's happened is because it's awarded to small schools, some charter schools have been getting it and keeping it for a very long time. And so what the legislature essentially was saying was, if you want to make a decision to be small by design intentionally, then you don't get that money because you're making that choice. So if you want to run a small school, then run it, but figure out how to pay for it. We're not going to incentivize it the same way we would incentivize or the way we would compensate like Anton Chico Elementary between Las Vegas and Santa Rosa, right? Mm-hmm. Those aren't the same thing. At New Mexico Kids Can, we thought that was very fair. Like, if you want to be small, that's great, but you're going to have to figure out how to pay for it. And schools we know can do that. So it is a change that small school size adjustment for charter schools will be phased out over 5 years. It was originally 3. And because of some great advocacy from charter schools, they were able to lengthen it to a 5-year phase out.
Some would say, and I'll throw possibly our mutual friend, Fred Nathan of Think New Mexico, and his name out there because Fred and his group have been among the leading advocates for small schools. Do you buy into the science, if you will, the studies that have shown that small schools do a better job overall, or is that something you don't buy into?
I don't say that we don't buy into it. I think it's just hard to get right. Like, it would be very expensive, first of all, and I don't think we have the money to be doing that sort of thing. And I think if you look at today, there's a real urgency. If there's a really good school, I want as many kids to be going to that school as possible. And we know that large schools can get results because we have seen them, right? Like, some of APS's large comprehensive high schools are A schools. La Cueva has been one for a long time. I graduated from Rio Rancho High School, very large school at the time of my graduation, great school. Mission Achievement and Success, huge charter school, serving 1,000+ kids, doing great things. So we're not saying that there shouldn't be small schools or there shouldn't be large schools, but that mix so that parents have options and can choose the one that works best for their kid is what we think works best.
Now, there's also an effort to ensure that more of the dollars spent on education went into the classroom. It's an issue we've taken some interest in, but I think it got some traction in this session. But how did that all play out, and how do you feel about it moving forward?
Well, we will see when the governor signs the budget if the language is still in the bill.
Yes, she still has to sign the
budget. So right now there is language that says that districts, depending on their size, have to spend a certain amount of their money on expenditures that are tied to the classroom. Now, we hear a lot of like, well, this wouldn't count and this wouldn't count. And we've looked at the numbers. We've looked at the way the bill was written. It's written very well. So things like a nurse that does serve students directly would count in that classroom spending level. Counselors, librarians, same things. It's really just above school level administration where we start looking at district level spending. We love that language. We think it's great. I hope it stays in the budget.
All right. Well, yeah, still to be continued here. We have until Friday, and we'll see how some of these things pan out.
A huge shout out to Fred and his team at Think New Mexico. They've just done such great work on that.
Yeah, no doubt. And spending money in the classroom is something that I think anyone who takes a serious look at the issues of education wants to do. And that hasn't necessarily been done. And I know I've seen, they're going back a few years, but the ratings of the states, New Mexico has been a state that's spent a lot more on bureaucracy and administration than some other states around the country. So any other issues, obviously the lawsuits, the Yazzie lawsuits and the reaction in terms of the spending, any other issues that you looked at this session that really will or will not impact positively the education of New Mexico children moving forward?
I really hope that the additional $486 million that we'll be spending on K-12 education this year gets us some positive benefit. I think depending on how that money is spent, where it goes, we were really strong advocates of making sure that it was targeted to specific things or programs. So what we didn't want is them just to say, like, let's keep the funding formula as it is, and then we'll just distribute $486 million more through the funding formula and cross our fingers and hope that it works.
Right.
So where there were targeted investments, like increasing the unit value for at-risk students, we thought that was good. Where there was targeted program investments, like increasing the amount of money that we're spending on K3 plus and expanding it to K5 plus, we thought that was good because there's a lot of data that tells us that when implemented well, that program gets great results for our kids. And so those are the sorts of things that we really stand behind and say, if we are going to increase our investment, let's increase it in ways that we can measure, that we can look back on and say, did that work? Did it not? How can we adjust it? And that's targeted towards where we know our problems are. And so I'd say we're moderately happy. We got some of those things and some not so much.
Yeah. I mean, we looked at it and said, well, they're going to spend a lot more money. We know that's coming. And I interviewed Representative Mo Maestas on this particular podcast right before the session. And I emphasized to him, I know the money is coming. I just hope you'll spend it in ways that actually have some accountability so that we know that our kids are going to be getting better educations than they would before. Because, if, like you just said, if you just dump more money into the existing system without any emphasis on change, it's going to not go very well. But you're at least moderately happy that happened. I was going to ask you for a letter grade, but you kind of gave me that sounds like a C. You're not.
Yeah, I would say C. I'm comfortable assigning a letter grade. I would say C.
And teacher raises, again, and I know there's so many issues that were dealt with, but we've seen walkouts in Arizona. Mm-hmm. We've seen strikes in other states, walkouts in other states. New Mexico has not had that happen. We're constantly told how poorly our teachers are paid in this state. And that, just because that may be a fact or may not be a fact, I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, doesn't mean that we're not spending enough in education. It just means that the money being spent is not always making it to hire teachers. So right. What's your take on teacher pay? Is it a money in search of a problem, or do you think we're actually going to get some better teachers out of this deal?
So we released a report right when we launched last year that kind of outlines all of the major issues in education and what our rankings are. That report told us that when you look at our peers, every state that borders us, we're actually in the middle when it comes to teacher pay median. So where we really lag is starting teacher pay. So I won't say that we didn't have an issue when it came to starting pay.
Real quick question. Do you include benefits or is it just take home pay?
This was just take home pay.
Okay.
If you add New Mexico's benefit system for retirement, then we are actually very attractive. But I will acknowledge, no, I'm not that old. So I remember when I was graduating college and looking for a job, yeah, benefits were cool, but I just wanted that big take-home salary. And that's where New Mexico was really having a hard time competing, specifically with Texas.
But that's another way in which New Mexico favors older teachers who have more years in the classroom and discourages younger teachers just starting out because, again, as you said, first and foremost, young people don't look at that.
Right.
Secondly, they don't look at it partially because the mentality of today, young people in general, and I'll even throw myself in this, even though I no longer consider myself a young person, but we expect to work 3, 4, 5, 6 more jobs. So the idea of working 25 years and getting that pension and all that, it's kind of a distant fantasy time.
Right.
So that those are all factors that could be used to drive teacher pay in a better direction.
And I would say overall, so New Mexico has 4 guiding, or New Mexico Kids Can, when we released our vision for the future of education, we anchored it in 4 guiding stars: excellence, options, innovation, and transparency. And part of what we mean by innovation is stuff like this. Like, why are we building pay schedules the same way that we've built them for decades? Is this really how teachers want to be paid in a system that only rewards them based on how long they've been in the system and how many degrees they've had?
It's the way their unions want them to be paid.
But is this how teachers want to be paid?
Oh, I don't know.
And so I think those are the sorts of things that, I'm not going to sit here and say that investing in paying our teachers more isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
I just wish we would look at it in different ways and that we would be more open to different options that allow more people and different people to enter into the profession, that allows a teacher to say, you know what, if I've done 10 years in the classroom and I need a break, that allows them some other avenues to maybe go and explore something else and come back, or, do some hybrid system with being a school leader and a part-time instruction leader. Those sorts of things that just aren't options today. We force this, you're going to enter this profession, you're going to do it forever. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not the way I've chosen to run my career. I can't imagine it continues to be that exciting for
And if
college
people
grads.
want to find your report, how do they find
It's on our website. So nmkidscan.org. And then there's a button that says research and resources, and it's state of education in New Mexico. Or if you search on social media using hashtag stateofednm 2018, it pulls up all of the graphics. So it's mostly graphics because those are easy to share and easy to understand.
Sure. Any other important issues, especially stuff that happened in the 2019 session, but anything else that we haven't really hit on in this conversation?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One, continuing on the teacher pay strand. We just increased teacher salaries to $41,000 for a level 1, $50 for level 2, and $60 for level 3. In New Mexico, those aren't bad salaries. And so while I understand that it is the most important, in my opinion, the most important profession in the country, those are not bad salaries. And so I think we just need to find some more reason in this conversation. But you mentioned the teacher strikes. And if you look at they went on strike in Denver. Mm-hmm. Denver teachers make more than we're paying our teachers in New Mexico. So for me, that was a little bit alarming because I thought, oh my goodness, if teachers in Denver are striking, then what does that actually mean for New Mexico? But I don't think that strike was about pay.
No.
And the same in LA. If you look at the LA teacher strike, I don't think it was necessarily only about pay. And at the underlying issue in some of these strikes are charter schools.
Yep.
And that's what makes me really, really nervous.
Right. And West Virginia is another one where the newly ascendant Republican majority has tried some school choice oriented efforts, and LA definitely about that. And the unions have reacted by calling strikes out. And, Arizona, it's worth noting, Arizona does pay its teachers significantly less than New Mexico. and the teachers there are not unionized, which means that it wasn't actually a strike, it was a walkout. But these are nationally organized efforts, whether it's through the union or even just through the grapevine, to get teachers into the political discussion and at the state level. And sometimes, LA is very highly paid, very bureaucratic, very unionized, all that kind of stuff. It really is transcending the country. And I think New Mexico is probably not in that discussion simply because we're such a blue state already that there's no point for the unions to kind of raise the rabble out here in New Mexico. So you said you had a couple points. So
there's that. We're obviously very interested. I believe the state goes back in front of the judge on the 15th of April. To say, here's what we've done.
Yes, the governor's signing role.
Is it good enough?
The judge takes on the role of the executive here.
And I think we'll be really interested to see what the judge says. When we've looked at funding lawsuits in other states, very rarely is it a 1-year thing. It's usually about 10 years of back and forth fighting. But certainly interested to see what happens.
And this judge is retired, right?
She's retired.
She's coming back from retirement.
I'm curious to see how long that part continues as well. But certainly, one of the things that we've been talking about when we talk about the lawsuit ruling is, yes, certainly there is a call when you read the ruling that says we have been underserving and thereby under-resourcing education in New Mexico, specifically for specific kids. Mm-hmm. But the judge is very clear about what outcomes she's looking at. And it is reading proficiency and math proficiency and graduation rates. So if we want to go into this world where we're only looking at spending but not looking at results, I don't think that's going to be favorable to the judge either. And I think some of the conversations we saw in the legislature were really heavy on the resource side and not heavy enough on the outcome side.
Yeah, well, outcomes are a very different proposition. It's easy to spend more money. It's a heck of a lot different to push increased outcomes. And that's even assuming that the education system is really capable of doing that in any sustained way. I mean, I think you and I both agree that the education system has to and should, but you've got a lot of issues and a lot of challenges to face to actually get those results done. Well, I really appreciate your time and your looking at this important discussion. We were at the Rio Grande Foundation playing defense on so many other issues that we just kind of let the education thing happen once we got past the moratorium discussion. And we were very much concerned about that as well moving forward. So it's good to see that at least charter schools continue to have that level of support in New Mexico. And hopefully we can get the education system moving forward and hope the money helps because they are spending a lot of it.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to this week's podcast discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work. Thanks for listening.